You ever read something about history that sounds so bizarre? You have to stop and wonder. Did people really live like this? I mean, I thought I'd seen strange, but nothing prepared me for what I'm about to tell you. This isn't the kind of history you learned in school. This is the kind you stumble on late at night, sitting in the dark with a cup of tea, and you're equal parts fascinated and disturbed. Tonight I'm taking you with me, not as a student or a listener, but as someone sitting right beside me while I walk you through what I've seen, read, and honestly imagined myself living through. From the lives of Egyptian concubines who woke up as state assets, to medieval marriage nights that were less about love and more about legal inspection, to the brutal, brilliant food culture of the Mongols. And I'm not just giving you the facts, I'm telling you what it would feel like if you or I were dropped straight into those moments. Trust me, once we start, you're not going to see history the same way again. You ever wake up and instantly know the day ahead isn't yours? That whatever you want to do doesn't matter because your schedule was written long before you opened your eyes? That's what it felt like for me. Except instead of a boss or a deadline, my life was dictated by a man who might not even remember I existed. The sun in Egypt doesn't exactly creep in. It spills through the shutters like liquid gold, hitting you whether you're ready or not. Outside, the Nile is already alive, birds chattering, oars slapping the water. But inside the harem, mornings are a quieter war. Just as my dream was peaking, something scandalous involving a shirtless scribe and an unreasonable number of figs, I heard the soft whisper of a servant. She bent over me, smile perfectly polite, voice light but with the kind of cheer that makes you instantly suspicious. "You look a bit puffy this morning." Ace. That's the ancient Egyptian equivalent of telling someone they look like they've aged 5 years overnight. Not exactly the boost you want before breakfast. I didn't get to roll over or groan. No, here, you don't sleep in. You are a royal concubine. Or in my case, one of many. And whether or not the Pharaoh even remembers your name, your body clock belongs to the department of looking perfect before breakfast. The linen sheets were scratchy. Apparently that's fashionable. And the second I stood, I was handed a bronze mirror. Not to admire myself. No, this was diagnostics. Does my complexion still glow? Have my lips lost their lotus petal sheen? Is there a rogue eyebrow hair plotting my downfall? The answers mattered more than whether I'd eaten in the last 12 hours. Before anything else came the stretching. Not for health, not even for elegance exactly. This was posture training. A crooked back meant bad profile angles, and bad angles meant you'd be stuck in the maybe later pile indefinitely. I spent 10 minutes walking the length of the room with a bowl of scented water balanced on my head, pretending I didn't feel ridiculous, pretending this wasn't the most absurd part of my day. Breakfast was next, a platter of dates, figs, and what I swear was a single pomegranate seed cut in half. Portion control by knife. I ate slowly because chewing isn't alluring, and here, allure was part of your job description. Around me, the other women did the same. We avoided each other's eyes because even in silence there was competition. Who blinks less? Who holds their posture longer? Then came the suggestion from the servant about a cool compress for my under eyes, which was code for, "You look like the Pharaoh prefers harpists this week." The cloth smelled faintly of lavender and ambition. And so the day began. Not with grandeur or romance, but with an endless checklist of tiny, exhausting rituals meant to make you look effortlessly divine. Which is ironic, because none of it was effortless. Bath time wasn't about hygiene either. It was transformation. You are not a woman with sleep in her eyes. You are a vessel of royal potential. That vessel had to be soaked, scrubbed, shaved, oiled, and perfumed, until I resembled something that belonged on a temple wall. The bathing chamber hit you with scent before you even entered. Lotus petals, jasmine oil, something labeled fragrance of divine intention. That probably cost more than my family's house. I stepped into the water like it was a stage and I was the morning performance. 2 attendants, both gentle and judgmental, scrubbed me with ground natron, a salty mineral powder that stripped away not just dead skin, but any last trace of village life. Hair removal came next. Every strand below the eyebrows, gone. Waxing, plucking, shaving, take your pick, none were pleasant. Queens don't complain, I reminded myself. They just hiss politely. Then came the oiling. Thick almond oil poured over me like I was some sacred pastry about to be baked. Standing was a challenge. I'd become a human candle. Perfume was layered, not spritzed. First a musky base oil, then citrus, then floral top notes until I smelled like a fruit basket attending a wedding. The scent was meant to cling all day. If the Pharaoh sneezed as I passed, that wasn't allergies, it was victory. Once dressed in a fresh linen shift, semi-transparent naturally, I had to sit upright for an hour so the oils could settle. Translation, don't ruin the shine. That was the rule. By now I wasn't cleaner. I was prepared. Prepared for the possibility, slim as it was, that I might be noticed today. The final act of the morning ritual was the assembly of my face. Forget inner beauty. Here, it was all about cheekbone symmetry and eyeliner so sharp it could serve as a weapon. I sat before a polished bronze mirror while a cosmetics attendant unpacked what looked like an artist's kit. Powdered galena, red ochre, crushed carmine beetles. First came the eyeliner, black coal applied with the seriousness of a priest handling sacred scrolls. One smudge, and I'd look tired, which was practically a career-ending injury. Lip color followed. Red ochre mixed with animal fat, which smelled about as appealing as it sounds. My lips had to be plump yet humble, an actual instruction I once heard a girl get. Then blush, to hide the fact that I hadn't had a proper night's sleep since last flood season. Eyebrows were shaped according to some mystical hierarchy I never understood, and perfume was dabbed behind my ears and on my wrists. Touch points the Pharaoh might one day grace with his presence. When I looked at my reflection, I saw someone who belonged in a tomb mural. All I needed was a god to hire me. And in this palace, that god was a man I might never speak to. After the bath and the painting and the perfuming, I was officially ready for the most deceptively dangerous part of the day, breakfast. Now the harem dining hall wasn't your typical clinking cups, chatter-filled mess hall. No one here laughed too loudly or reached for food without intention. Think of it as a fashion runway disguised as a meal, where every step, every tilt of the head, every flicker of an eyelash was a move in an ongoing game of social chess. We glided toward low tables dressed in semi-sheer linen, the kind that whispered approachable but ambitious. Dozens of us sat, but no one truly relaxed. It was a room full of crocodiles stalking herons, slow, silent, calculating. My meal was minimalistic, to put it kindly. A small plate of honeyed dates, 2 figs, and a dab of yogurt. Enough to keep me upright, but not enough to challenge the cheekbone structure I'd just spent 2 hours sculpting. I ate with 3 fingers only, because forks were centuries away, and besides, here gluttony was as bad as gossiping about the Pharaoh's mother. Of course, gossip wasn't absent. It was just coded. "Oh, your coal is so bold today," one girl cooed from across the table. She smiled wide, but her eyes didn't match. I thanked her politely, while making a mental note. Her eyeliner was crooked, her earlobe slightly uneven. Tiny weaknesses cataloged for later. This was the way of things here. A younger concubine sat beside me, all bright-eyed and brimming with energy, and loudly mentioned she'd been up all night practicing the harp just in case the Pharaoh was feeling musical. Translation: she was sure tonight was her night. I didn't take the bait. I just smiled and let a fig seed rest dramatically on my lip. A subtle, calculated move that said, "You're not the only one who knows how to perform confidence." The room was full of similar microdramas. Quiet competitions disguised as casual glances, passive-aggressive compliments wrapped in silk. Someone whispered about a girl crying in the baths last night. Another muttered about borrowed perfume. The game was never ending, and the rules changed without warning. You couldn't eat too quickly. Greedy, you couldn't eat too slowly, trying too hard. You aimed for casually elegant, which in practice meant counting out your chews and pretending you weren't counting out your chews. The servants poured palm wine, but only a splash. Too much, and someone might tell the wrong story to the right person. Here, your worst enemy wasn't the Pharaoh's disinterest. It was being remembered for the wrong reason. Aha. Breakfast ended with the ceremonial brushing of teeth, using chewed twigs dipped in natron. I caught my reflection in my bronze mirror. My face said, "One more meal survived. One more battle fought without raising a sword." But there was no time to retreat. After breakfast came the part of the day I dreaded the most, visibly existing in an aesthetically pleasing manner. Sounds restful, right? Wrong. We were led into what they called the relaxation gallery, a sunlit space filled with embroidered cushions, potted palms, and carefully placed trays of flowers. It was a room designed for one purpose: to be seen looking beautiful while doing absolutely nothing. You could pick an activity, but only ornamental ones. Reading hieroglyphs aloud? Too intellectual. Playing the harp? Perfect. Smelling flowers while gazing out the window like you were thinking about love, politics, or the mysteries of the afterlife? Highly encouraged. The trick was looking effortless while calculating every single angle of your posture. Some girls tried too hard, striking poses that screamed, "Pharaoh, pick me!" Those efforts were met with polite nods and quiet whispers that would eventually crush their spirits. I'd learned better. I specialized in accidental elegance, letting my sandals slip off while stretching, sighing like I'd just remembered a romantic tragedy, shifting into the light as though the gods themselves had placed me there. This was performance art disguised as leisure, and the stakes were high. Occasionally, a scribe or messenger would pass through. We pretended not to notice, but of course, we noticed. The point wasn't to chase attention. It was to look like the kind of woman attention naturally found. If, by chance, someone later told the Pharaoh, "That third girl on the left had an air of mystery today," you'd just advanced one step on the invisible ladder. I spent 2 hours doing nothing beautifully. My spine ached, my smile muscles burned, but my posture never faltered. That's not laziness here. It's strategy. Once we'd collectively proven we could exist like statues without blinking too much, the tone shifted. It was time for education. Not the useful kind. Oh no, this was concubine school, where the subjects were harp tuning, poetry recitation, and how to tilt your head just so when discussing dreams. Music was the crown jewel of skills. Play a harp well enough, and you could rearrange the chord hierarchy without saying a word. Our instructor had us plucking traditional love songs, lines about blooming hearts and intoxicating eyes, reminding us to mean it, or at least fake it convincingly. Then came poetry. Not writing it, heavens no. That was for old men with ink-stained fingers. We recited, softly, with emotional restraint. I practiced saying, "The moon weeps for my longing," without laughing, though the moon couldn't care less about my longing. A priest occasionally stopped by to quiz us on mythology, just enough to compare the pharaoh to various gods without messing up. Anubis meant strength, Thoth meant wisdom, Ra meant power. Mix them up, and you'd be the girl remembered forever as the one who called the pharaoh a jackal. At the end, we were tested subtly. If the king asked you your favorite god, what would you say? Correct answer. Whichever one he reminds me of. Always. By the time class ended, my voice was hoarse from gentle recitation, my fingers sore from harp strings, and my head heavy from all the tilting. But the day wasn't done. Next came refinement drills. Walking like smoke, smiling like a goddess, never tripping in front of royalty. The instructors had us balance clay jugs of water on our heads while walking the corridor. Every step was a wager between gravity and dignity. Then dancing, swaying like river reeds, hips loose but respectable. Gesture lessons followed. Never point, always extend. Never wave, always fan. Even kneeling had rules. Devotion in the eyes, but never desperation. Finally, voice training. We practiced saying "my lord" 20 different ways, from "humbled by your greatness" to "please stop breathing near me." By the end, I wasn't sure if I'd mastered seduction or passive aggression. But here, both were survival skills. When the drills ended, we were herded into the common rooms, the palace's version of a break area, except here, break didn't mean rest, it meant surveillance. The place was filled with silk-clad women locked in silent wars over eye contact and seating arrangements. You'd think the most valuable skill in the harem would be dancing or singing, but no, it was gossip. The right gossip could buy you protection, topple a rival, or land you in the Pharaoh's line of sight without ever stepping into his chamber. I took a spot near a group threading beads, safe enough to blend in, close enough to listen. Gossip always started innocently. Which servant had dropped a fruit bowl, who tripped during harp practice? But within minutes, it slid into the real stuff. Who'd received new jewelry? Who'd been seen leaving the astrologer's quarters with smudged eyeliner? Who'd been quiet since the sandal fitting last week? Names weren't spoken directly. They were implied. The tall one with the heavy perfume. You know, the girl who always looks like she's about to sneeze. Everyone nodded knowingly. The senior women rarely spoke. They listened. Because in here, gossip was currency. If you knew the Pharaoh preferred honeyed wine to date wine, that was leverage. If you knew which priest his mother didn't trust, that was insurance. You couldn't be invisible, though. If you said too little, you were irrelevant. Too much, and you painted a target on your back. I learned early to contribute in small doses, just enough to seem engaged, never enough to give anyone a weapon. Some of the older concubines kept coded wax tablets, records of rumors, alliances, and betrayals. They'd never admit it, but I've seen them glance at those little scrolls like generals checking battle maps. Of course, there was a line we didn't cross. No one gossiped about the Pharaoh directly. That was suicide. But everyone gossiped about each other. That was practically a civic duty. By the end of the hour, I'd learned 3 new facts about people I barely knew, made subtle eye contact with 2 potential allies, and mentally noted a possible future enemy. Success by palace standards. What? After gossip hour came the strangest part of the day. The long, drawn-out wait for the possibility of being summoned by the Pharaoh. The waiting chamber was gilded and fragrant, full of low cushions and silk curtains. We were all posed, serene but alluring, relaxed yet radiant, like paintings pretending to breathe. I chose a seat near the window so the sunlight would catch my cheekbones. Not that I'd practiced that or anything. The rules were simple. No slouching, no looking bored, and absolutely no showing how much you wanted your name called. A servant entering with a fruit bowl could cause the same ripple of attention as a royal summons. Every 15 minutes, we shifted positions, not for comfort. Comfort was forbidden, but to prevent our limbs from locking up. You had to be ready to glide to the Pharaoh's side as if you'd been floating in a dream all day. Sometimes girls hummed softly, others recited love poems under their breath. One sat with her lute, strumming quietly like she was serenading fate. I sipped my wine and pretended not to judge her choice of chords. Hours passed. The sound of sandals slapping stone echoed down the hall. Everyone froze. Then, silence. False alarm. Someone was just heading to the latrine. When a name was finally called, it was never shouted. It was whispered, reverent, like a secret prayer. The chosen one would rise gracefully, acting as though this hadn't been the only thing on her mind all day. The rest of us smiled like we were thrilled for her, even as we mentally tallied our own losses. Tonight wasn't my night. Again. I smiled anyway, kept my posture, and reminded myself that in the palace, patience was just another performance. And then, without warning, the atmosphere shifted. The great royal wife was coming. We didn't hear her footsteps so much as feel her presence, like a sandstorm made of silk and perfume. The room went silent. Conversations died mid-word. She appeared in the doorway, older than most of us, but still carrying herself with the confidence of a woman who didn't have to try anymore. Her kohl was darker, her headdress taller, her jewelry heavy enough to double as weaponry. She didn't rush. She walked slowly, deliberately, making eye contact with each of us in turn. Not warm, not cruel, just assessing. And always with that faint, amused smile that said, "I know which of you think you're clever, and I know which of you cried in the bath last week." When she spoke, it was never direct, always vague, yet sharp enough to leave a mark. I do hope the younger women are behaving with wisdom. No names, no accusations, just a subtle detonation that left 3 corners of the room quietly panicking. I offered my most respectful smile, the one I saved for people who could have me reassigned to weaving duty with a single word. She nodded slightly in my direction. That meant I was safe today. Itiu. Some tried to impress her, retelling myths with perfect timing, adjusting vases just so, complimenting her anklet like it was a sacred relic. She humored them. She'd been us once, but she'd played the game better and won. And then she was gone, leaving behind the scent of myrrh and a room full of carefully measured breathing. Conversations resumed, softer now, more careful. She didn't need to stay to keep her presence felt. The queen had walked through, and the hierarchy had been silently reinforced. By the time the sun slid low and painted the palace walls in gold, the air shifted again. Even the servants moved differently, quieter, more deliberate, as if they, too, could feel the tension thickening. This was the part of the day we called maybe tonight. Perfume was reapplied, hair was retied, linen was smoothed. It didn't matter if you'd been ignored for weeks. Hope in the harem had a way of regenerating overnight. You couldn't be caught looking anything less than ready. The younger women treated it like a festival, humming softly, practicing harp melodies, or casually mentioning they'd dreamt of royal cobras and marriage, a not-so-subtle hint at their ambitions. The older ones, seasoned by years of this ritual, didn't waste energy pretending. They sat back, sipping their wine with that calm, measured detachment that only came from knowing the odds. Nah, me? I'd learned to split the difference. I'd smile vaguely, posture perfect, giving the impression of someone who was neither expectant nor resigned. Inside, of course, I was rehearsing my reaction. How to look surprised, but not too surprised. Grateful without seeming desperate, yeah. The waiting chamber at night felt different than in the morning. The light was softer, oil lamps casting amber shadows that turned every movement into something deliberate, almost theatrical. The air was thick with the competing scents of rose oil, myrrh, and tension. Then, the sound that could snap every spine in the room straight. A servant's footsteps. Ai? She entered quietly, bowing slightly, eyes lowered. The ritual was always the same. She'd stand just inside the doorway, draw a breath, and speak a single name in a voice barely above a whisper. If it was your name, you rose as though this were the most natural thing in the world. You didn't rush, you didn't gasp, you floated. If it wasn't, you mastered the art of the gracious loser. You smiled warmly at the chosen woman, maybe even adjusted her sash as she passed, while quietly swallowing the taste of disappointment. Tonight the name wasn't mine. I gave the appropriate nod, the practiced half smile, the good luck in my eyes that didn't quite reach my bones. She glided past, barefoot, smelling faintly of victory. The rest of us stayed in the lamplight, posture still perfect, as if the night could somehow be salvaged by sheer will. Eventually, the truth sank in. No one else would be called. One by one, we retreated to our chambers, our faces carefully neutral. Hope was tucked away like jewelry, to be brought out and polished again tomorrow. My nightly routine began by removing every layer of the day. Jewelry first, each piece unhooked with care. Then my makeup, wiped away until I looked like myself again, or at least the version of me I recognized before palace life. Another bath, this one quiet and utilitarian. Not for display, not for transformation, just to wash off the residue of rose oil and ambition. The water felt heavier at night, as if it, too, carried the weight of waiting. I slipped into my night linen, soft and unadorned, and settled onto my mat. Around me, the harem quieted to a low murmur. This was dream time, a realm where ambitions didn't have to obey reality. Women whispered about visions of lotus petals, talking birds, and pharaohs with lion heads. The dreams were poetic, strange, sometimes clearly fabricated to gain favor the next day. That's. Here dreams weren't just entertainment, they were currency. A well-timed vision could be used to climb the ladder, especially if it conveniently flattered someone important. I'd seen it happen. A girl claimed she dreamt of the queen offering her lotus blossoms, and suddenly she was invited to the queen's embroidery circle. Coincidence? No. Strategy. I kept my own dream journal, just a cracked papyrus scroll tucked beneath my mattress. Some entries were genuine. Others were carefully constructed in case I ever needed to share them. Flooded courtyard, symbolic of emotional repression. Pharaoh smiled at me, then turned into a fish. Still not sure how to spin that one. Sometimes I shared dreams with my closest friend here, a woman with eyes like sharpened bronze. Tonight, I whispered about a cat walking backward and offering me a crown. She nodded without hesitation. Definitely Bastet, she said. Power is coming. We both pretended to believe it. Yeah, because here, belief, real or staged, was one of the only luxuries we could afford. Lying in the dark, I thought about freedom. Not the kind that meant running through open fields or visiting the market alone. That was gone. No one leaves the palace without permission, and permission is rarer than emeralds. Here, freedom meant something smaller, more intricate. The ability to influence who sat where at dinner. The power to suggest a certain poem be recited at court. The satisfaction of watching a rival falter during harp practice because of a rumor you'd set in motion weeks earlier. It wasn't much, but it was something. I remembered the girl I used to be before this life. A sunburned child chasing goats through the dust of my village. She'd been free in the can-go-anywhere sense. Now I was free in the can-shape a conversation without speaking sense. Which was better? I didn't know anymore. The truth was, freedom here was always an act. A performance, like everything else. The better you performed, the less anyone questioned whether you were free at all. One day I'd leave this place. Maybe I'd be replaced by someone younger, sharper. Maybe the pharaoh would grow bored and send me to a country villa to fade into obscurity. Maybe I'd vanish without anyone remembering my name. And yet, I hoped. Hoped that when I was gone, someone might remember me. Not for beauty, because everyone here was beautiful, but for the steadiness of my hands, the sharpness of my mind, the way I could endure without bending. Maybe one day in some quiet corner of the palace, a servant would whisper, "She once made the pharaoh laugh." Maybe a young concubine would unknowingly mimic my posture. Maybe a scribe would find my name buried in a ledger, line 34, extra lotus oil for concubine, name illegible. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough. I closed my eyes. Outside, the moon hung full and indifferent. Somewhere above, music drifted from the upper chambers, a soft, haunting melody that reached me like a memory I couldn't place. Tomorrow, I'd wake up and do it all again. The bath, the coal, the breakfast politics, the ornamental existence, the gossip, the waiting. Because here, the hope that maybe tonight could turn into tonight was the most intoxicating drug of all. The palace life I'd just described, that was one kind of performance. But in medieval Europe, I discovered an entirely different kind of theater, one that took place not in the harem's waiting chambers, but on a wedding night when the celebration didn't end with the feast. It ended in the bedroom. Or rather, it began there. I want you to picture this. You're newly married. The feast has stretched into its final courses, and you're already exhausted from smiling at people you barely know. Your stomach is heavy with roast meat and spiced wine. Your cheeks ache from pretending every toast was hilarious. And just as you're hoping for a moment alone, someone claps their hands. It's time. The bedding ceremony. The moment your marriage truly begins, and the part everyone's been waiting for, though not for the reasons you think. This wasn't a matter of slipping quietly away. No, the entire concept of privacy was alien here. A marriage wasn't sealed with a kiss, it was sealed with proof. Proof that the two of you had done it. The audience? Not just your closest friends, but family members, clergy, nobles, even the most politically nosy members of the court. They didn't stop at the door. Aye. The transition from banquet to bed was loud and theatrical. In some places, it was almost like a parade. Servants carrying candles, musicians playing something halfway between celebratory and mocking. Friends and relatives, some tipsy, others just nosy, forming an entourage around the bride and groom. If you were lucky, their role ended at the threshold. If you weren't, they'd stick around. In France, the custom even had a name, charivari, a noisy, rowdy serenade full of bawdy jokes and off-key songs. Imagine trying to walk with dignity toward your bed while a chorus of drunk cousins sings about fertility in rhymes that make the priest cough. The bride would be escorted by her female relatives, the groom by his male companions. Each group had their own job, hers to keep her from fleeing, his to keep him upright if he'd had too much wine. And yes, sometimes he had. Once inside the chamber, the symbolic undressing began. And this wasn't a tender, let me help you with that kind of undressing. This was a ritual. The groom's friends might strip him down to his undershirt, the bride's women removing her layers one by one. Each garment had symbolic meaning, the removal of childhood, of modesty, of autonomy. Sometimes there was a blessing over the bed, sometimes a shared drink, wine or spiced milk, as a last comfort before the main act. Then, and in some cases, the witnesses didn't leave. Imagine that, your first moments as a married couple, with someone's aunt standing in the corner, a midwife lingering near the bedpost just in case, and two noblemen pretending to study the wall while keeping one eye on the sheets. Why? Because this wasn't just about romance. It was about politics. A noblewoman's virginity was political capital. A nobleman's ability to consummate the marriage was a legal obligation. Without consummation, the marriage could be annulled, and without witnesses, it was your word against theirs. So, the ceremony became both symbolic and practical. A contract signed with bodies instead of ink, and yes, sometimes with actual ink afterward if a bishop or court notary was present to confirm the act. It's absurd when you think about it now, but in that world, the bed was a courtroom, and the two of you were both the defendants and the evidence. Now let's pause for a second, because I don't want you thinking this was always some dignified, candlelit moment. Sometimes it veered straight into comedy, or humiliation. I once read an account from a small village where the groom's friends decided it would be hilarious to swap his nightshirt for a woman's robe. Another from Germany told of newlyweds being placed on a bed with wheels and paraded through the streets before they could even start. In Ireland, older women would gather outside the door, shouting advice on fertility and childbearing like an uninvited pep squad. But in the upper ranks of society, the pressure was deadly serious. The groom's ability or inability to perform could determine the fate of alliances, dowries, even the future of kingdoms. And the bride's proof of virginity, usually expected in the form of blood on the sheets, was treated as hard evidence, despite being medically unreliable. Which brings me to the part no one talks about. What it actually felt like to be in that position. I try to imagine it from the bride's perspective. You've been raised for modesty your entire life, taught to avoid a man's touch, warned about impropriety at every turn. And now, after a day of feasting, you're expected to strip bare, touch someone you might barely know, and perform for an audience, however small or discreet. Or from the groom's perspective, you're equally unprepared. The wine has made your head foggy, the expectations are crushing, and you know that if you fail, it won't just be between the two of you. It will be public knowledge before sunrise. And the tension must have been unbearable. And yet, for many, this was just how it was done. You didn't question it. You performed your role, literally, and hoped the witnesses left quickly. But for others, those witnesses lingered, listening for sounds, watching for movement, sometimes even inspecting the bed afterward. The morning after wasn't just about breakfast, it was about evidence. I'll never forget reading about the bed inspectors, midwives or older relatives tasked with examining the sheets for blood. A single stain could mean success, honor, and legitimacy. A clean sheet could mean scandal, annulment, or worse. And yes, women faked it. Animal blood, pricked fingers, anything to avoid the humiliation and political disaster of a failed bedding. In the worst cases, if the consummation didn't happen, it could spiral into public trials, church inquiries, and accusations of impotence or impurity. Imagine that. The most private moment of your life turned into a legal case, with witnesses, testimonies, and in some cases, physical examinations. It wasn't love. It wasn't intimacy. It was a performance with real consequences. And the scariest part, in many noble circles, this wasn't optional. It was law. If you thought the most uncomfortable part of the bedding ceremony happened at night, you'd be wrong. The morning after was its own ordeal. Forget waking up to birdsong and sunlight spilling across your face. What you got was someone knocking, entering, and heading straight for the bed, not to bring breakfast, to inspect the sheets. The bed inspector could be a midwife, a senior female relative, or, in royal circles, a high-ranking lady of the court. She'd lift the linen with the care of someone handling state documents, eyes searching for the telltale stain of blood. In their minds, that red mark was proof of virginity, honor, and a legitimate union. Without it, trouble, ache. The absurdity, of course, is that biology doesn't guarantee bleeding the first time. But this wasn't about science. It was about politics, optics, and reputation. No stain, and suddenly the whispers began. Was she pure? Was he capable? Was there a deception? Hey, for a bride, this was dangerous territory. If people believed she wasn't a virgin, the marriage could be annulled. Her dowry might be returned, alliances broken, her name forever tarnished. For the groom, a failure to perform could be equally humiliating, triggering rumors of impotence or unmanliness, rumors that could haunt him for life. Some women faked it, pricking a finger or smuggling in a drop of animal blood to stain the sheets. Risky, but often the only way to survive a failed first night. And even if the sheets passed inspection, the ordeal didn't end there. You were expected to appear together for the morning meal, sometimes still in bedclothes, while servants delivered watered wine and bread with smug little smiles. The glances you got weren't congratulatory, they were evaluative, measuring. In villages, it was even more public. Neighbors might gather outside your home, singing lewd songs or performing fertility dances. It was celebration wrapped in communal voyeurism, and there was no opting out. Then came the gossip. Servants talked first. They always knew. A single offhand comment. She looked pale this morning. He seemed awfully quiet, could spread like wildfire. Relatives whispered, sometimes dropping accidental hints during church or market days. Even priests could join in, weaving delicate allusions into sermons that left the couple squirming in the pews. If things had gone badly, the gossip turned ruthless. I read about noble weddings where the failure to consummate sparked full-blown investigations. In France and England, courts sometimes ordered tests of the groom's virility. Yes, public demonstrations, often humiliating beyond belief. One 16th century nobleman had to endure physical examination in front of witnesses after his bride claimed nothing had happened. For brides, the consequences could be worse. Without proof, some were sent back to their families in disgrace, their futures reduced to exile in a convent or marriage to someone far below their former station. A few even faced violence, beatings, imprisonment, or worse, at the hands of husbands desperate to save face. Annulments were the nuclear option. If the marriage was declared invalid, the political fallout could be catastrophic. Dowries were disputed, treaties collapsed, family honor stained. In an age where marriages were more about alliances than love, one failed wedding could shift the balance of power. And yet, for all its seriousness, the wedding ceremony wasn't the same everywhere. In Scandinavia, for example, the bride might be carried, sometimes upside down, across the threshold, symbolizing her transition from maidenhood to marriage. It was dramatic, though not exactly dignified. Yeah. In some rural German traditions, the bedding became part of a noisy spectacle. The newlyweds might be wheeled through the village on a literal bed, neighbors banging pots and pans the whole way. The idea was to ward off evil spirits. Subtlety clearly wasn't a priority. Net. In Ireland, the public part often stopped at the chamber door, but that didn't mean privacy. Older women of the village would hover nearby, ready with fertility charms, unsolicited advice, and sharp critiques of the bride's hips. French royal weddings sometimes made the bedding a legal spectacle, complete with signed documents and clergy present to bless the bed. In Spain, Catholic symbolism dominated, a crucifix over the bed, prayers recited before any intimacy. Passion, of course, was optional. Among peasants, the rituals could be a little looser, but they were no less public. A couple might still be serenaded or interrupted mid-act by rowdy villagers banging on shutters. Even when the intent was celebratory, it kept the act firmly in the realm of communal property. What struck me most, learning all this, was how universal the lack of privacy was. Whether you were a princess in France or a farmer's daughter in Ireland, your wedding night wasn't just yours. It belonged to the community, the court, the church, everyone but you. The expectations were staggering. You were supposed to be modest but willing, nervous but successful, private but performative. You were meant to carry the weight of political alliances and family honor in a moment that, today, we'd consider deeply personal. And the strangest thing? People accepted it. No one thought it was strange for a bishop to bless the bed. No one blinked when older women inspected the sheets. No one questioned why two people's most intimate moment was treated like public theater. Because in that world, the bedding ceremony wasn't just tradition. It was the final binding signature on the marriage contract. Without it, there was no marriage. And without witnesses, there was no proof. If you think the bedding ceremony sounded invasive, just wait until you hear about medieval dental care. If you can even call it care. Let's start with this. There were no toothbrushes, no toothpaste, no floss, and no concept of bacteria. Your mouth was just another hole in your face, and if something went wrong in there, you didn't see a specialist. You prayed, you chewed herbs, and when the pain became unbearable, someone yanked the tooth out. The average diet didn't help. Bread was coarse and often filled with gritty bits from the millstone, grinding your enamel down like sandpaper. Meat was rarely fresh unless you were wealthy. Vegetables were boiled into oblivion, and though sugar was rare, decay still spread fast. By your mid-20s, your mouth probably looked like a crumbling graveyard, crooked, yellow, and missing some key residents. A cavity wasn't treated, it was left to fester. The dull ache would grow sharper, swelling your jaw until the pain fogged your mind. Infections didn't just make you miserable, they could kill you. But no one understood that. If you died from a dental abscess, They assumed it was divine punishment, not bacteria eating its way into your bloodstream. Remedies were creative. You might mash herbs into a poultice and press it against your gums. If you had money, maybe you'd rinse with honey and vinegar, which sounds fancy until you realize it's just sugar and acid. Two things your teeth hate. I read about people holding a hot poker near the cheek to draw out the evil humors, which seems more like a dare than a treatment. But eventually, someone would say the words no medieval person wanted to hear. It has to come out. That's where the barber-surgeons came in. Ira. Now, barber-surgeon sounds like a man who cuts your hair and saves your life in the same afternoon. And that's exactly what he was. These were the working-class doctors of the day. They weren't trained in universities or studying anatomy in Latin. They learned on the job, often from another barber who taught them two essential skills: how to sharpen blades and how to keep a person alive long enough to collect payment. Tooth pulling was considered minor surgery, so the physicians left it to barbers. Their tools were simple but terrifying. Iron forceps, long-handled pliers, curved hooks, and, occasionally, bare hands. None of them were sterilized. If you were lucky, the barber wiped them on a rag between patients. If you weren't, the tool might still be slick from someone else's mouth. There was no anesthesia. If you were rich, maybe you'd get a strong drink. If not, you bit down on leather or a stick and hoped for mercy. The procedure could go two ways. A skilled barber would clamp down on the tooth and yank it in one clean motion. A less skilled one would tug, twist, and break it, forcing them to dig into the gum with a hook to fish out the roots. People screamed, people fainted, people vomited, but most came willingly because the pain of a rotten tooth was worse than the brutality of having it pulled. Some barbers became famous for their speed, traveling from village to village like rock stars of oral misery. They'd set up in the marketplace, hanging their freshly pulled teeth on strings as proof of their skill. And here's the wild part. Sometimes tooth pulling wasn't done in a back room. It was done as entertainment. Traveling tooth pullers weren't always medical men. Many were showmen, colorful characters who doubled as peddlers, magicians, or musicians. They'd set up in the town square, call out for volunteers, and work in front of an audience. Blood was part of the show. Screams? Even better. They'd boast about their gentle hands, sometimes using a planted assistant who pretended to be cured on the spot. Once the tooth came out, they'd hold it up like a trophy, then try to sell you miracle powders and herbal rinses to keep the rest of your teeth healthy. These were usually just wine mixed with spices, but they looked exotic, and that was enough to sell. But not everyone left with a fixed smile. I read accounts of botched pulls, jaws dislocated, gums torn open, infections setting in within days. But the choice was simple. Live with the pain until it killed you, or take your chances in the chair. It wasn't just the poor who suffered. Even kings and queens had mouths full of decay. Sweet, sticky foods were a luxury for the elite, but they destroyed royal teeth just as fast. Queen Elizabeth, I was so afraid of extractions that a bishop had one of his own teeth pulled in front of her to prove it wasn't that bad. She still refused treatment until infections spread to her jaw. The upper classes had their own coping mechanisms, painting their teeth with white lead to cover stains, poisoning themselves in the process, chewing perfumed pastilles to mask the stench of rot, and keeping their mouths closed in portraits to hide the damage. Salam. For the average medieval person, oral hygiene was more about breath than decay. People chewed aromatic twigs, hazel, juniper, or mallow, frayed at one end to scrub the teeth. They gargled with wine, vinegar, or even urine, believing its acidity could cleanse the mouth. Tooth powders were made from crushed bones, ashes, and herbs, applied with a rag or finger. Some remedies were downright bizarre. Powdered mouse skulls, boiled dog's milk, spider webs stuffed into cavities, to trap the pain. None of it worked. When nothing else helped, they turned to superstition. Toothache was sometimes blamed on toothworms, imaginary creatures that burrowed into your teeth and gnawed at the roots. People tried to smoke them out by blowing hot vapor from burning henbane seeds into the mouth, which usually just blistered the gums. Charms and prayers to Saint Apollonia, the patron saint of tooth pain, were worn around the neck. In wealthy circles, you might be given a holy relic to hold near the jaw and told to wait for divine mercy. But mercy rarely came. When it didn't, you ended up back in the barber's chair, staring at iron tongs, praying he was one of the good ones. That was medieval dentistry. No numbing, no sterilization, no guarantees. Just the hope that after the pain and the blood, you'd walk away with one less tooth and a little more peace. If the medieval dental world was about surviving pain, the Mongol diet was about surviving everything else. Harsh winters, blistering summers, endless wind, months of travel with no permanent kitchens. The Mongols didn't just eat to live, they ate to conquer. When you picture a Mongol warrior, don't imagine him stopping for lunch. Meals happened on the move, often on horseback. You didn't sit down to 3 courses. You grabbed what you could carry, what would last for weeks without rotting, and what would give you the strength to ride for days at a stretch. The backbone of that diet was meat: mutton, goat, and horse. Not the seared, seasoned kind you might picture, but meat prepared for survival. Most of it was air-dried into thin, leathery strips called borts. Borts was genius in its simplicity. Slice the meat thin, hang it in the cold, dry air, and let the wind do the rest. The moisture vanished, the flavor condensed into something salty and intense, and the result weighed almost nothing. Properly dried, it could last for months, even years. Drop it into boiling water, and you had soup. Chew it as is, and you had enough protein to keep you in the saddle from sunrise to sunset. I say eat. Even the horses weren't just for riding. They were a portable pantry. A wounded or old horse would be slaughtered for meat, but living mounts provided another resource: milk. Mare's milk. Fresh mare's milk was turned into airag, the national drink of the steppe. Making it was simple but constant. Milk the mare up to 6 times a day, pour it into a leather bag hanging from a saddle or yurt doorway, and stir it constantly. By hand, or by giving the bag a kick every time you walked past. Within a day or 2, the milk fermented into a fizzy, slightly alcoholic drink that was sour, smoky, and, according to Mongols, incredibly refreshing. Heed. I tried imagining my first sip of airag. The closest comparison I can think of is yogurt that decided it wanted to be champagne, but changed its mind halfway through. Foreign visitors often hated it, describing it as tangy vinegar churned with milk that had gone too far. But for the Mongols, it was life. It quenched thirst, provided calories, and was so central to hospitality that refusing a bowl was considered deeply insulting. And if you let airag age longer, you could distill it into a stronger liquor called arki. Clear, sharp, and definitely not for the faint-hearted. Grains and vegetables? Rare. The Mongols didn't farm, they herded. Bread was an occasional luxury. Fruit was even rarer unless traded for. The steppe diet was almost entirely meat, fat, and dairy. Even blood was on the menu in emergencies. A small cut to a horse's neck would yield a pint of blood, enough for the rider to drink without harming the animal. It was rich in iron, high in calories, and kept a warrior alive when other food ran out. On long campaigns, battlefield rations were brutally efficient. A Mongol could carry a bag of borts tied to the saddle, a flask of fermented milk, and maybe a lump of dried cheese called aru, so hard you could break a tooth on it, but packed with nutrients. Fat was prized above all else. Dumplings stuffed with rendered mutton fat, cakes made of fat and flour, soups with enough grease to coat your lips for hours. These weren't indulgences, they were insulation. In cold weather, fat kept you warm. In war, it kept you alive. Nanas. They even had an ingenious hot meal on the go trick. Put a pouch of meat and water under the saddle and let the animal's body heat slowly warm it as you rode. By nightfall, you had a lukewarm stew without ever lighting a fire. Chensa. Cooking when done at camp was straightforward. Inside the gur, the Mongol yurt, food was boiled over the central fire in a cast-iron pot. Salt was scarce, spices rarer still. Flavor came from the meat itself, from the fat, from the smoke in the air. One of the most dramatic dishes was boudog, a goat or marmot stuffed with hot stones, sealed and cooked from the inside out. When opened, the meat was tender, smoky, and dripping with fat. Dairy was everywhere. Butter, yogurt, cheese, clotted cream. Fresh dairy was eaten in summer, dried dairy in winter. Arrol, the rock-hard curd, could last years and was the perfect travel snack, if you had the patience and teeth to chew it. Hospitality was sacred. If you visited a Mongol camp, you'd be offered food before anything else, meat, broth, or a bowl of arag. Refusing was not an option. Sharing food wasn't just politeness, it was survival etiquette. On the steppe, generosity could mean the difference between life and death. And food wasn't only about eating, it was diplomacy. Foreign envoys were always fed first, often with the best cuts of meat and the richest broth. The shoulder meat was an honor. The rump meant you were less important. The way a meal was served said more about your standing than any word spoken. The Mongols' ability to feed themselves anywhere, under any conditions, was part of why they could conquer so much land so quickly. Armies in Europe depended on supply lines. Mongol warriors were their own supply lines, carrying everything they needed on horseback. Preservation techniques were unmatched. Drying, fermenting, smoking, salting when possible. Meat was stored in leather bags, fat in sealed skin pouches, dairy in clay or horn containers. Nothing was wasted. Every part of the animal was used. Then, even the rules of eating were bound by spiritual beliefs. You never wasted food. You didn't spill blood indoors. Bones were buried or fed to dogs, never thrown carelessly. The fire inside the yurt was sacred, never stepped over, never used to burn bones or food waste. Fish was rarely eaten. Water was home to spirits, and disturbing it was risky. Nanten? And yet, despite their simplicity, Mongol meals could also be grand. At the court of Kublai Khan, feasts brought together dishes from across the empire. Chinese dumplings, Persian stews, Indian spices, Armenian wine. Meat towers sculpted into horses or dragons stood alongside bowls of mutton broth, a reminder that even in luxury, the Mongols never forgot their roots. That's the paradox of Mongol food. It was both brutally practical and deeply symbolic. It could be carried across deserts without spoiling, yet it could also be used to seal alliances, impress guests, and display the reach of an empire. Eating like a Mongol wasn't about pleasure. It was about readiness. Every bite was fuel for survival, for battle, for expansion. And maybe that's why, centuries later, you can still trace their influence in the dumplings of Russia, the yogurt drinks of Turkey, the grilled meats of Central Asia. They left their mark not just on history, but on dinner tables across continents. If there's one thing the Mongols understood better than anyone, it was that food wasn't just about calories. It was about survival, honor, and identity, and those values shaped every step of how they handled it. Preservation wasn't optional. It was an art. On the open steppe, where you might ride for days without stopping, fresh meat was a luxury you didn't count on. Drying was the foundation. Strips of mutton or horse hung from ropes strung between yurts, exposed to the cold, dry wind until they hardened into borts, compact, lightweight, and nearly immortal. You could ride across half of Asia with nothing but a pouch of borts and a pot to boil it in. Borts wasn't just survival food. Ground into powder, it became an instant soup base. Just add hot water. It was the steppe equivalent of instant noodles, only made of pure protein. Dairy got the same treatment. Fresh milk in summer became yogurt, butter, and cheese. Excess milk was churned into butterfat, stored as blocks of clarified butter, or dried into rock-hard curds, arrol, that could last for years. Erul was so tough it could double as a weapon if you threw it, but it was packed with energy. Kids gnawed on it like candy, and warriors carried it as a portable ration. Yeah. Fermentation was the other key. Milk didn't last long fresh, so it was turned into arag as quickly as possible. Cow, goat, and sheep milk could be fermented into sour creams and yogurts that resisted spoilage, stored in skin bags or clay pots. The acidity kept them safe, and though the Mongols didn't know about bacteria, they knew these foods kept them healthy on the move. Salt curing and smoking were less common, but still used when resources allowed, especially in areas with fish or game. Organ meats were boiled, then packed in fat to create a crude confit, sealing in flavor and keeping out rot. Then, storage itself was clever. Leather bags, felt-wrapped bundles, and even the hollowed stomachs of animals served as containers. Saddlebags doubled as both transport and pantry. You didn't need shelves or jars. You needed something that could survive being strapped to a galloping horse. And through it all, there was ritual. In Mongol culture, you didn't just eat. You followed rules. Wasting food was spiritually dangerous. The fire in the ger, the yurt, was sacred. You didn't throw bones into it, didn't step over it, didn't pour food into it. Bones were buried or fed to animals. Liquids weren't poured on the ground near the yurt either. Everything had its place, because everything could offend the spirits. Yeah, Kar. Certain foods were avoided altogether. Dog meat was taboo. Fish, though plentiful in rivers and lakes, was rarely eaten. Water was considered the home of spirits, and disturbing it could bring bad luck. End. Hospitality was more than politeness. It was law. A stranger arriving at your camp was fed before they were questioned. Meat, broth, or irag was offered immediately. Refusing food, especially irag, was more than rude. It was an insult to your host's honor. That hospitality had political weight. In the Mongol Empire, food was a diplomatic tool. Foreign envoys were judged by how they accepted it. Refuse the irag, and you might offend your host enough to lose an alliance. Bring your own delicacies. Dates from Baghdad, wine from Armenia, and you might gain favor. Daniel? Meals were a silent language. The best cuts of meat, shoulder or brisket, were reserved for honored guests. Rump or lesser cuts sent a quieter message. You are tolerated, not valued. Feasts sealed deals. Alliances, marriages, military agreements, all confirmed over mutton towers, bowls of dumplings, and endless toasts with irag. And those toasts? They weren't optional. If you drank deep. Declining was like walking out of a negotiation mid-sentence. What fascinates me is how this practicality and ritual blended into their imperial feasts. At the court of the Khans, the food reflected the empire itself, vast, varied, and stitched together by the nomadic core. You'd have Persian stews rich with dates and almonds next to Chinese dumplings steaming in bamboo baskets. Flatbreads perfumed with saffron sat alongside simple boiled mutton. Indian spices mingled with steppe dairy. Wine from the Caucasus, rice liquor from China, distilled arka from Ajit Irag, all in golden cups. Yet even at the height of luxury, they kept bowls of plain mutton broth on the table. A reminder of where they came from, of the food that had carried them across continents. And that's the legacy that survives. You can see it in Russia's pelmeni, in Central Asia's manti, in China's baozi, meat wrapped in dough, quick to make, easy to carry, born from the steppe's need for portable meals. You taste it in kefir, in Iran, in every tangy fermented dairy drink from the Balkans to Turkey, descendants of the mare's milk tradition. You find it in the skewered meats of Uyghur markets, in the fatty lamb soups of Siberia, in the spice-infused kebabs of Persia. Even the way modern armies think about rations, lightweight, high-calorie, long-lasting, echoes the Mongol approach. They proved you could feed an empire without a fixed kitchen, without fields of crops, without waiting for supply lines. And maybe that's the part that sticks with me most. For the Mongols, food wasn't about indulgence. It wasn't about chasing flavor for its own sake. It was about readiness, being able to move, fight, and survive without stopping. It was about using what you had, wasting nothing, honoring the resources that kept you alive. And yet, they knew how to make it social, how to turn eating into a shared act that reinforced bonds. Whether it was a simple bowl of broth by a campfire or a table groaning under the weight of imperial dishes, the meal wasn't just sustenance. It was connection. Sometimes I imagine riding across that endless grassland, the wind in my face, a pouch of borts at my side, a skin of arag swaying from the saddle. The food might not be luxurious, but it would carry me as far as my horse could go. And when I stopped at a stranger's ger, I'd be handed a steaming bowl of broth, no questions asked, just the unspoken understanding. We share what we have, because tomorrow, it might be you sharing with me. That's not just food culture. That's survival turned into tradition. And tradition turned into history.